All right, so before we get into the actual video, I have to give a little bit of an update here. Actually, after recording and doing most of the editing of this video, I was literally editing the last 5 to 10 minutes of the footage when I got the call. My wife was diagnosed with an extremely aggressive, rare cancer, an adrenal cancer, and we're going to have to fly out to a cancer center to see what we can do about this. I'm mentioning this at the beginning of the video because later on in the video, I'm going to talk a lot about what the next steps are for the channel and schedule and stuff like that. I honestly just can't bring myself to change the video at this point. One, just because I don't have the time, and two, because I kind of just don't want to change this little moment from just about a week ago where I was very optimistic and looking into things in the future. I would like to continue the channel. I probably will. My wife really likes these videos, so for her sake, if nothing else, I plan on continuing it eventually. But I'm not sure exactly when that is. So I wanted to get this video uploaded since it's basically done anyways, and she was really excited to see what everybody was going to say about it online. And she helped me edit part of it. Actually, she helped me edit the entire script. But I'm not really sure what the future holds at this point. Honestly, for a lot of this video, I'm specifically going to talk about dealing with trauma and bad news and you know, asking yourself why is God making this happen? You know, questions like that. I'll admit that at this point right now, I'm honestly a little bitter at myself at how confidently and almost condescendingly I make these points. I don't know, maybe in the future I'll come to find it worthwhile. I hope that you all enjoy it nonetheless. You know, this is just my state of mind. But in any case, I don't want to bring down the whole video with a very long intro. I just want to give this update, and I want to put it right at the beginning so that nobody misses it and then wonders where the channel is, because I imagine I probably am not going to be very active on comments after this video either. This is all happening very, very quickly, and I really don't know what's going to happen next. So again, sorry to bring everybody down. I hope you still enjoy the video. I think this is a really good one. Again, my wife really liked it. She helped me edit it, so I really want everybody to watch it and enjoy it, and I will probably continue the channel, but it's probably going to be a little while before I can actually do that, and I'm not sure exactly what form that's going to take. So if you want to know when that happens, subscribe, and I guess you'll get the notification when I finally publish something. But yeah, with that out of the way, let's get into the video.
Hey, I'm Luke, and today we're talking about A Memory of Light, last book of the Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. If you're here after watching the entire summary, then congratulations. You've proven that you have what it takes to really dig into literature. In recognition of your talent, you have been recruited by the Star League to defend the frontier against Zur and the Kodan Armada. Either way, if you're here for my analysis of A Memory of Light, and really the Wheel of Time as a whole, then you're in the right place. We're finally here at the very end, and I'm really excited to get into it. It should really go without saying at this point, but just to be sure, if you're watching this video and you haven't read the entirety of the Wheel of Time, including New Spring, but most significantly A Memory of Light, then you should really stop watching and go read it first. I'm about to thoroughly spoil this book, and really the series as a whole. This is an excellent book, it's a great series, and it's really worth reading it for yourself. Don't ruin it by jumping to the head inside a YouTube video. For today's analysis, I'm going to start by talking about the main theme of A Memory of Light, and the ending of the series as a whole. In particular, I want to get into the worldview or message that I think is conveyed here, and I want to do so while focused entirely on the ending we actually got, without considering what could have been done differently or picking it apart. Once we've come to properly appreciate just how really truly fantastic the ending we got is, then we can have some fun playing with other possibilities and picking things apart. There are definitely some things to criticize in A Memory of Light, and I don't want to ignore that, but I also really, really don't want it to overshadow what was really done just incredibly well about this book. Once I'm all done with that heavy stuff, then I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the future of this channel. Yes, I do plan on making more videos, but I'll get more into that later on. And we'll close out the video with a few minutes just kind of talking about interesting things, fun bits that really didn't have any other place within the more rigid framework of the bulk of this video. I've got to say, despite all the time I've spent on the summary and on this analysis video, seriously, I finished the actual book like 5, maybe 6 weeks ago now, and I've been working on this almost every single day since. I'm still somehow stuck in that post-series kind of melancholy of feeling like, God, I need something new. I can't believe it's over. I'm actually really surprised and really impressed with this series that despite spending several weeks focused 100% on the ending, I still wish there was another book. But there isn't. We have what we have, and today we're going to talk about it. To properly discuss A Memory of Light, I think we need to start by asking ourselves a seemingly stupid question. Why are novels the way that they are? Why does The Eye of the World, following the prologue, start with Rand and Tam riding to the Wine Spring Inn to deliver casks of brandy for Beltane? Why not Beltane, or Mayday, or Samhain, or something like Sam's Hine? Why not Duality? Why not someone's 111st birthday? Why do they ride horses instead of a truck or a spaceship? Why doesn't Rand drive himself into Tassi Station to pick up the power converters? Why not start later in the story, perhaps with Rand failing to resurrect the girl in Tyr? Or why not earlier, having the whole first book take place in the Age of Legends, rather than just the prologue? Why do some of these alternatives feel more suitable than others? There are real answers to these questions. It's the start of a fantasy series. Literally anything could have happened in the opening chapter. As we ask ourselves why we got what we got, I want us to consider the different perspectives or layers of what this question really means. The most obvious perspective is probably to just consider the rules of the universe, characters, and plot that comprise the Wheel of Time. The story begins at the end of spring, so it's time for festivals marking the start of summer, which is why it's Beltane and not a holiday from another time of the year. It's Beltane rather than Beltane because this is a story from far in our future, and many of our words and traditions have morphed in a way that Robert Jordan took care to make feel realistic. The holiday here is Beltane because the Two Rivers culture has inherited Gaelic influences. They ride horses because this is a pre-industrial society, though we do see steam engines appear much later in the series. They live outside of town because Rand and Tam are humble farmers and shepherds, bringing brandy as their contribution to the festivities. Why is Rand a humble shepherd? Well, because the pattern needed him to learn humility to temper the worst of Lews Therin's flaws in preparation for the last battle. Rand will later note that the main difference between him and Lews Therin is that Rand had a better upbringing. We could go even further, considering character motivations. Rand and Egwene are at that age, and this Beltane could be a big deal for Rand. As we learn later in the series with both Rand and Perrin, Tam is very good at supporting younger people without making a show of it. This is a really good time for Egwene's parents to think positively of Rand and his family. With the wolves and the weather the way that they were at the time, Tam didn't much want to leave the farm for this Beltane. He says as much to Bran. But again, it's not a very good time for Egwene's father to think that Rand and Tam aren't invested in the community. I like to refer to this level of analysis as lore. Considering questions about literature in terms of lore encourages us to engage with the world of the literature in a deep way, taking it for granted that it's real in some sense. Just looking at my bookshelf behind me, it's clear that I love lore. I've got Encyclopedia Eorzea, World of Warcraft Chronicles, the Destiny Grimoires, multiple Diablo lore and art books, and a lot more on there. I store these books right alongside more real works like The Tale of Genji and Le Morte d'Arthur, and multiple translations and commentaries in the prose and poetic Eddas, and these in turn are right next to The Art of Computer Programming and The Idea Factory, rounding out this whole spectrum of books that I'm interested in. I intentionally place these books on the same shelf to emphasize, to myself and to anyone looking in my office, that I'm interested in ideas, not rigid hierarchies of fiction versus nonfiction. Some of the first essays I ever posted online, some 20-some years ago, were about the lore of Neon Genesis Evangelion, and now I'm spending the bulk of my time making videos that frequently touch on the lore of the Wheel of Time. I'm dropping my lore cred here specifically to soften the blow when I say that I feel like the current state of popular literary analysis has, perhaps, come to focus just a little too much on the lore. I particularly see this in discussion of video games. Look, Elden Ring was fine. It was good even. I wrote a whole review of it that I absolutely do not plan on turning into a video, but it was good. If you search for anything about Elden Ring on YouTube, and then sift through all the poorly named OP build videos, you'll find an incredible amount of fan analysis about every scrap of lore in the game, each character, location, item, spell, and line of dialogue. You'll also find some great videos digging into the references used to build up this world. Again, this is good content. A lot of what I've done in my videos here is on this same level of analysis. But I'd like us to consider that lore, a sort of metaphysics for the literature we're discussing, is just a small part, one tiny facet of literary theory, in much the same way that IRL metaphysics is just one branch of philosophy as a whole. By focusing solely on lore, we ignore the fact that the author chose to create this lore and not some different lore. So again, why does our story start with Rand and Tam riding to the Wine Spring Inn to deliver casks of brandy for Beltane? Well, one of the core themes of the Wheel of Time is the notion of cyclical time. A seasonal festival, one marking the transition between two seasons, puts this theme in our minds right away, whereas a birthday party, while still marking the passage of time, is less cyclical, more maybe conical, really, spiraling towards an end. It's nearly summer because our young characters are just on the verge of transitioning from the springtime of their childhood into the summer of their young adulthood. Summer is also the time of the sun and the light, which is a good place to start an epic that will eventually take us into a long winter in a battle against the shadow, and then end at noon with a lot of other light and sun imagery. It's specifically focused on the Gaelic Beltane because, like with Samhain, there's a focus on leaving offerings to appease the Aishi, beautiful magical beings with long lives in mysterious ways, often mispronounced as Aes-Sid, and sometimes considered, depending on context, to be the descendants of the Tuatha De Danann. So they don't, for example, take the village's children away to live in their fairy kingdom, which is exactly what Moraine and Aes Sedai has come to do. Beltane, like many spring and early summer holidays, also has a fertility element, which certainly fits the whole town's expectations for Rand and Egwene, and also gives context to all the interest in getting Tam a woman. As an American from the Midwest, I hazily remember celebrating May Day at Catholic school. For me, it brings to mind black and white habits and Queen Mary, and the whole thing feels a little old-fashioned or even provincial. Robert Jordan wasn't Catholic, so I doubt he thought of habits or the idolatry of Mary, but perhaps it felt similarly provincial and old-fashioned to him, which suits the rural people of the Two Rivers just fine, while also setting the stage for the senseless, cruel tragedy of a Trolloc attack on people who aren't ready for it and don't deserve it in the least. Well then, why are they riding into town to deliver brandy? Well, because Rand and Tam are simple shepherds and farmers. Egwene doesn't need to ride into town. She already lives there, as the mayor's daughter. Even among the simple villagers of Emond's Field, Rand and Tam are humble. This draws a parallel between Rand and Jesus, but it also makes Rand very easy to just form a connection with. The very first thing that happens to a person in the Wheel of Time, excluding the prologue, is that Rand feels cold. He's human and fragile. We can empathize with him. He felt a little foolish about wanting to reassure himself that Tam was still there, but it was that kind of day. He's still a little bit childish, but he's old enough to be a bit embarrassed about it, yet not yet old enough to recognize that the embarrassment here is more childish than the feeling itself. But he also knocks an arrow to his bow. He's young and innocent, but he's also capable of defending himself. They may be humble farmers, but they're part of the community. There's a quiet, noble dignity to our humble father and son. Tam is also a good father and a wise, level-headed man, which we see right away. Good fathers, particularly ones that are wise and nurturing rather than merely strong defenders or high earners, are really surprisingly rare in fiction. It seems clear to me that Jordan specifically wanted his writing to have some good fathers in it. We could keep going here, but my point is that this sort of analysis is both similar and different from what we had before. We're not just talking about the rules of the Wheel of Time here, we're considering why Robert Jordan as an author made these decisions. We're also considering how these decisions fit into a larger literary context and how this affects us as readers, regardless of the author's intent. Perhaps it would help to see this as 4 layers. At the top we have lore, the rules of the universe. Rand and Tam are riding horses because the steam engine hasn't been invented yet and because they live on a farm outside of town. Then we have genre and trope, readers' expectations of what a book is like. Rand and Tam are riding horses because the Wheel of Time is a high fantasy genre, and because it's inspired by Lord of the Rings. That's just what you do in something like that. The third level is author intent, what the author wants to accomplish with the series. Rand and Tam ride horses because Robert Jordan wanted distance to mean something, and he wanted to emphasize how powerful traveling is once it appears. It's Beltane because Jordan wanted to emphasize a broad theme of cyclical time, and this is a good way to put that idea into our heads early in the series so we're primed for it when characters like Harad Fell state this more directly a few books in. The last level, then, would be author psychology. Why does Robert Jordan want to convey this particular message? Rand and Tam ride horses because Jordan just likes horses, and he wanted to talk about them a lot. He liked the sense of scale in The Lord of the Rings and wanted his world to feel similarly large and rich in a way that you can't really experience if you're just speeding past the scenery. He wanted to emphasize the inequality between people who can travel and people who can't, perhaps to highlight similar inequality in the real world. Anytime we start to consider, for example, whether his experience in the Vietnam War is related to the story, we're dipping into this level of author psychology. All right, so now that you have those levels, forget about them. I just made it up. Look, literary theory is really complicated, and there are countless ways to break things down. Those 4 levels might be a useful lens in some cases, but like with any tool, it loses its value if you come to rely on it too much. You can hammer in a screw, but should you? Don't throw out your hammer, just set it aside when a screwdriver suits the task at hand. This model in particular focuses on the author and their intent. This is useful when we're actually interested in what the author meant, as in a historical context where we might actually be more interested in what the author meant than what they actually said. It can also be used purely as a way of thinking about the text to understand the meaning. Actually, just to clarify, have I made it sufficiently clear that I don't actually care about Robert Jordan or Brandon Sanderson? I talk about what Robert Jordan meant all the time, but I only do that as a way to engage with the books for my own understanding. I've never met Robert Jordan. I've never met anyone who's even had a conversation with him. Robert Jordan isn't even his name, but I'm not going to start talking about James Rigney Jr. or Jim. It's entirely possible that some of the notions I've attributed to Robert Jordan were completely unintentional. Like, my video on New Spring focuses on the story as a Yuri romance. It's entirely possible that could Robert Jordan watch my video on New Spring, he'd say that that's exactly what he meant. But it's also possible that he'd wonder why on earth I brought up Japanese girls' love comics in relation to his epic fantasy story in which literally all in-universe socially acceptable romance is between a man and a woman. It's certainly interesting to consider, for example, whether the similarities between Egwene's time in the White Tower actually were meant as a reference to the civil rights movement and nonviolent direct action. I think there's actually a really high chance that this is literally true. At the very least, I'm reasonably confident that a church-going American man born in 1948 in South Carolina who wrote a book series with several significant non-white characters, some good and some evil, including a dark-skinned empress of an empire founded on slavery on a continent to the west of not Europe, was at least aware of the civil rights movement and of Martin Luther King Jr. But given words like Idam and Soldam and how much spanking goes on, maybe he really was just thinking about BDSM. There's nothing wrong with that. People can write about whatever they want. But I personally find the civil rights meaning to be more meaningful. I wouldn't abandon that reading even if I learned that it was entirely unintentional. Why would I? Make me. So when I asked what Robert Jordan meant about something, this is more of a useful perspective, another tool, than a literal question. Anthropomorphism is extremely useful in thinking about even very technical problems. When discussing chemistry, we might say that atoms want to have a noble gas configuration. Thinking of atoms as disliking an almost full or almost empty valence shell can help reason about how a reaction works, but there's obviously no real will involved there. And this is a massive oversimplification of the actual chemistry in any case. We do the same thing when talking about organisms evolving by trying to compete. The software book, Structured Interpretation of Computer Programs, famously states, quote, "In effect, we conjure the spirits of the computer with our spells." The difference with literature is that there actually is, in fact, an author. Robert Jordan is a pen name, but he was a real person. He actually did mean things. Interviews and notes can provide us with a source of authority when the text is ambiguous. In my video on The Gathering Storm, Anonymously Opinionated and Norpen83 pointed out that Rand's sword is justice, which I saw as inconsistent due to the description of the sword in The Great Hunt. Now, these two actually made a really solid case just using evidence from the text, which was enough to convince me that they were right. But after reading Origins of the Wheel of Time, I now also know that Jordan actually had this sword in his office, which would have been another solid point in this debate if I hadn't already been convinced by the textual argument. On the other hand, I also heard that Sanderson mentioned in an interview that Lanfear somehow survived having perhaps the strongest man in the entire series break her neck, squeezing it until he feels and hears it break in his hands. Perrin can smell when someone's scared. How the hell can't he smell whether someone is dead or pretending to be dead? She doesn't move or do anything else after this in the scene, so there's no point to having her character survive. She can't just be masking her scent unless she can somehow mimic the scent of being dead, which should be impossible no matter her skill in the dream, as she doesn't have Perrin's nose. Just projecting a vacuum would be a dead giveaway. She would actually have to have the scent of being dead good enough for his nose to be fooled, which she can't even sense. Her survival would actually kind of weaken the point of Perrin finding it in himself to murder a woman in Rand's stead, or how his journey to center his sense of self on Fail allowed him to break free of the compulsion. So do we agree with Sanderson's point, made years after the book came out and completely unsupported by the actual text, merely because he said it? Well, maybe. I mean, that's kind of my point here. With literature, there's rarely a single correct answer. Sometimes that really sucks. like when interpreting a legal document or scientific studies. But for fiction, it's kind of the best part. The key to being an effective reader is to synthesize your own meaning from your personal connection with the work. What I'm really trying to convey here, and I really hope that I'm not starting off my last video on the Wheel of Time with a boring, confusing rant, is that there are a lot of perspectives to consider when analyzing a work of literature, and these perspectives can conflict, overlap, and shift depending not only on what we're discussing, but on what we want to discuss. Something can make sense in terms of the world's lore, but not in terms of sending a coherent message to the reader. Or maybe it completely makes sense, but it's just not very exciting. Or maybe it's exciting, but it fails to make a political point as well as the author intended. Maybe it makes a political point perfectly, but the author actually disagrees with that point and would hate that people were taking it that way. That only matters to the extent that we make it matter. So, as we get into the actual discussion on A Memory of Light, I want you to bear in mind that a novel is a message created by an author and meant for an audience, but it's only truly realized through the awesome power of your imagination. As you read it, you build up your own version of the novel in your head that won't perfectly match what the author or any other fan holds in their head. This is intentional. A book with no room for interpretation would feel hollow and flat. Much of the meaning you find in a book is, in truth, meaning that you created yourself. Yet the author also had some things that they really wanted you to see. You may not see it in exactly the same way they did, but the hope is that you'll share something with them. Not merely a specific statement or argument, but a perspective, a little piece of the author as a person embedded in the world they helped you build. As we read through the Wheel of Time, we built up an experience in our minds. We built it together with Robert Jordan and perhaps together with other fans. Perhaps some of you watching read the series along with me, and these videos became a part of the experience for you. Reading and responding to comments as I went along, many of you have become a part of the experience for me. Just considering that other people would watch these videos influenced how I thought of the books. It made me consider things more carefully and with the focus on how people different from me might interpret things differently. Maybe some of you read this series back when it came out, but you continue to refine your understanding of it by engaging with other fans, discovering new details with each reread and each fan discussion. These are novels. They're not just media products. The goal wasn't merely to entertain us. It was to make us see some aspects of reality in a certain way. Robert Jordan had a very long point to make, and we all sat down and heard him out to the end. Now that he's finished talking, it's our turn to respond. With that in mind, let's get into it. So there's a part of me that really wants to boil down the Wheel of Time into one great theme that encompasses all others. But no matter how I squint at my whiteboard, I just can't quite do it. The closest I came to finding one unifying theme is the endless knot, which actually does fit so perfectly that I wonder if it was intentional, but I don't think it's going to be a particularly useful perspective in itself for us, if only because it's not a common concept in the West, so I would still need to explain that in just as much depth as the series itself. It's just kind of an unnecessary middleman here. I think we really have 4 themes which are strongly intertwined. More precisely, I think we have 3 abstract themes which are all in service to a single practical theme. The cyclical nature of time, the changing of meaning across metaphorical distance, and the concepts of duality and non-duality work together to form a broad worldview that puts the events of life into a broader perspective. These perspectives give us the tools necessary to deal with the problem of evil, overcome trauma, and grow. When we examine our suffering from multiple angles, we can see that even if an event seems overwhelmingly heavy to us, it's actually very flat and light when viewed from the side. No matter how isolating or all-encompassing pain may seem, if we can learn to see it from outside of ourselves, then we can reason about it with wisdom. Pain teaches us to do better. It connects us to others who have suffered as we have, and it shows us how the actions of others affect us, and thus also how our actions affect others. A moment that may seem as though it will last forever will, in fact, end, just as it has for so many other people, and sooner than we might think. With a proper understanding of the role that evil plays in the world, we can come to terms with the horror and seeming injustice of an omnipotent God who would willingly permit evil to exist in the world. The world and plot of the Wheel of Time form a worldview, but it doesn't exist for its own sake. Our character arcs demonstrate how we, too, can leverage these perspectives to embrace the suffering brought about by evil, put it behind us, and move on to the next adventure, the next life, stronger and wiser for it. I already mentioned the theme of cyclical time a couple of times now, so let's start there. In the Wheel of Time, time is literally cyclical. It's on a wheel. As I first learned while listening to Grammar Girl, wheel and cycle actually appear to have the same root if you go all the way back to the Proto-Indo-Europeans, kweklos. In terms of lore, this is very literal. We know for a fact that people are reborn. Herod Fell makes a very good case that even the battle with Chattin is cyclical. Way back in Lord of Chaos, he predicted that Ran would need to remake the prison, not merely patch it. Quote, when the wheel turns back to here, back to where they drilled the hole in the first place, the Dark One's prison has to be whole again. But it also goes deeper than this. Brigitte has had many lives, but they were all different. Ran learns that people are reborn so they can do better than they did in previous lives. Events repeat, but not in quite the same way. As we're repeatedly reminded, there are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the Wheel of Time, but it was a beginning. Each day, each season, each life has its own challenges, sorrows, joys, and loves. If we can see the pattern, then we can see how familiar each iteration is, while also appreciating the novelty of this particular time. The dragon will ride again on the winds of time, but Rand al'Thor has just one life. Perhaps the best example of this is when Rand learns that Elaine is pregnant. I'm going to be a father, he thought, not for the first time. Yes, Lews Therin had had children, and Rand could remember them and his love for them. It wasn't the same. He, Rand al'Thor, would be a father. Even with a clear understanding of what it means to be a father, the emotional depth is undiminished for him. Rand has learned to understand the cyclical nature of time without being calloused by it. Anyone with pets can probably relate. It doesn't matter how many pets you've had through your life. Each birth, youth, adulthood, old age, and death is just as precious and impactful as the rest. But the experience of past pets makes you more prepared to handle each new situation better. You probably won't go to the vet for silly reasons as often. You'll be less shy about cleaning up messes, and you'll be much better at obedience training and pet-proofing a room. But you'll also find that none of that preparation lessens the joy of a half-beat puppy, kitten, or kit, or mitigates the despair of death. It's always the same, but it's always completely different. If that sounds like a contradiction, don't worry, we're going to get to duality and non-duality in a while. This realization that time is cyclical is key to Rand's awakening. His denial of nihilism and despair and embrace of life, love, and hope. Why, Rand? Why do you go to battle? What is the point? Why? All was still. Even with the tempest, the winds, the crashes of thunder, all was still. Why? Rand thought with wonder. Because each time we live, we get to love again. That was the answer. It all swept over him. Lives lived, mistakes made, love changing everything. He saw the entire world in his mind's eye, lit by the glow in his hand. He remembered lives, hundreds of them, thousands of them, stretching to infinity. He remembered love and peace and joy and hope. Within that moment, suddenly something amazing occurred to him. If I live again, then she might as well. That's why he fought. That's why he lived again. And that was the answer to Tam's question. I fight because last time I failed. I fight because I want to fix what I did wrong. I want to do it right this time. Don't limit yourself by considering the Wheel of Time purely in terms of lore, as merely the way things work in the Wheel of Time. I think this reflects a worldview that Robert Jordan wanted to share with us for real life. Everything that happens has happened before in some form and will come again in some other form. In the moment, it may feel like you're the only person to ever experience loss, love, or frustration. You may at times feel as though the world is ending, but there are no endings and never will be endings to the turning of the Wheel of Time. If you could just see your life from the perspective of someone from the distant past or distant future, you'd see that while your journey is unique and worthwhile, it's familiar even to people separated from you by a vast gulf of time and space. What I really want to emphasize here is that while the cycles of ages and lives across reincarnation are a very clear way to demonstrate this worldview, you don't need to die or live hundreds of years to see cycles both within your life and between lives. That's where Andril comes in. Andril may go on to live a very long life as an Ashaman, but when we meet him, he's still young by Aes Sedai standards. Yet he's lived many lives through his various vocations and travels. Even Pavara, multiple times his age, is impressed by how much he knows, not just in terms of facts, but in his worldview. Andril has the perspective to swallow his pride and accept ridicule when necessary. He knows when to fight and when to retreat. He has an inner strength, integrity, calm, and confidence that we can associate with age and wisdom, and it comes from his many experiences. Of course, this applies even more broadly than that. You don't need to switch careers a dozen times anymore, you need to live several lives. This isn't about finding one specific pattern, but learning to see the myriad patterns that weave through all time. We can learn concrete lessons from spotting these patterns. If you garden, you'll probably do a better job next year than you did this year. You'll learn which pest solutions work and which don't. You'll get a little better at using the right amount of water and fertilizer every year. If you garden for a long time, then you'll also start to see longer-term patterns, rotating plants or adding some more nutrients to keep the soil healthy over years. You'll learn what to do differently in an unusually dry or unusually wet year. The longer you do it, the more problems you'll encounter and solve. If you're clever, you'll ask around to see what other gardeners in your area have to say. The best experience to learn from is someone else's. That's how we grow, not merely as individuals, but as a society. But it's not just about concrete lessons either. It's also about perspective. Consider stress at work. In the moment, it can feel like a project is the most important thing in your entire career. Did you even know about it 5 years ago? Even if it goes as terribly as you fear, will you really look back on it in 10 years as the moment that ruined your life? I suppose there are some very rare cases where this might actually be the case, but not only is that kind of rare, but it's also impossible to tell in the moment what the future is going to bring. Maybe you really do screw up so bad that you get fired, but then that gives you the impetus to start your own company. Maybe the stress was literally killing you, and you would have been dead in 5 years if you'd gotten that promotion. From the perspective of a moment, living without seeing the greater pattern, we can only see what's right in front of us. Even true hell, being the victim of a real tragedy with no upside, will pass with time if you let it. Think of Rand holding onto the weight of losing his hand. Ignore the part where he gets a new body and just think of him sparring with Tam. Yes, fighting with one hand isn't an advantage, no matter how you spin it. As I mentioned when covering the scene where Rand lost his hand, I really don't see this as a lesson or an advantage in any way. It was just sad. But Rand didn't need to stop practicing with swords altogether. The peace practicing with the sword gave him was still there, as Tam showed him. Time and support help. You can't simply skip the time. Even knowing that it'll get better won't make it better right away, but it can still be comforting to understand that it won't last forever. Nothing lasts forever. We can see the cyclical nature of time in literary references too. Everything in the Wheel of Time has roots in other stories. We have characters named for King Arthur and his associates. The plot and some of our locations are based on the Lord of the Rings. Symbolism from Norse mythology, various Eastern religions and philosophies, and Gaelic folklore appear throughout the books. This building upon existing ideas is common to all literature. If you can't see it, then you're not looking hard enough. Yet each story is also new. You could read every book Robert Jordan ever read and still be surprised by the events in the Wheel of Time. I don't think that Robert Jordan believed in literal reincarnation in the real world or in a literal Wheel of Time. I imagine that he probably held either the current scientific understanding of the world's history or a fundamentalist Christian one, and neither theory supports reincarnation directly. Or maybe he did. The specifics don't really matter to me here, again. Though the Wheel of Time is fantasy, it arose from a certain worldview that I think we can appreciate. This has all happened before. It will all happen again. No matter how alone and alien you may feel, you have kinship with countless people extending backwards and forwards in time, even with your past and future selves. It's about perspective, scope. Don't despair at falling leaves. They'll enrich the soil for the coming spring. When we forget this, when we lose sight of the pattern, we become vulnerable to despair. So, don't forget it. As you've probably already noticed, I really can't talk about any of these themes without also mentioning the others. So, we already talked about cyclical time. Now let's turn our attention to meaning over distance, or meaning over metaphorical distance, or maybe how meaning changes as it crosses thresholds. All right, so this section was the hardest to write by a lot. My first draft had about a 15-minute section on information theory that even went into the specific math to calculate units of entropy. It was way too much. You don't need all of that. All you really need to know is when I say distance here, I'm talking about thresholds between perspectives. Sometimes this just means shouting down a hallway, trying to be understood over background noise of lawnmowers and barking dogs. Sometimes it means recording and cleaning audio for a YouTube video, crossing the distance of internet publication. But it can also mean trying to explain something to someone who doesn't share any language with you, or trying to explain a bit of scripture to someone who doesn't share your religion. Distance here can be the distance between you and someone writing a book hundreds of years ago. It can even be as simple as trying to talk about the Wheel of Time with someone who hasn't read it yet, which is a discussion that crosses the threshold of having read the Wheel of Time. Like the other two themes, it's about perspective, but the point in this section is about how meaning changes as it passes from one perspective to another, and how the degree of difference, or distance, between two perspectives impacts this change. And finally, how this change can actually be a good thing. Not the degradation of a signal over distance, but the evolution of meaning for a new audience. Time is cyclical, and events echo throughout time, but they're always just a little bit different from before. But, and this is key to this perspective, the differences aren't arbitrary or random. Rand is a continuation of Lews Therin, but he's not the same man. When Rand opens his heart to Lanfear, she's shocked by what she sees. The truth that, deep down, it was not Lews Therin who made up Rand's core, it was the sheepherder, raised by Tam. The wheel of time turns, and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again. Through time, the details of a moment degrade, but the truth within takes on new meaning in each time that it's remembered in. As we learned in The Eye of the World, long ago there were two great entities in the world, Merc and Mosk, who fought with great weapons of fire that could reach around the world. Now they are no more. For us today in the real world, the details of this story are critically important. Will America and Russia truly launch ICBMs at one another? Who will survive this breaking of the world? Can we stop it? As Aviendha and the Wise Ones conclude regarding a different crisis, it doesn't matter if we can stop it, we must try. But for the people at the end of the Third Age, it hardly matters whether the weapons were lances and spears of fire or ICBMs. The lesson is that there were two great entities, powerful beyond the understanding of individual people, but they used their power for war and then they were no more. Perhaps Elaine should think on this story when considering how to strengthen Andor. How will an arms race end? Which nation will rise up as a giant to oppose her, and how terrible will their great weapons be? In the end, won't they be doomed to the same fate as the giants? Fortuona, too, should appreciate that, mighty as her empire is, the giants of the past left the world without leaving more than the slightest trace of memory. It's not hard to imagine, as in Shelley's Ozymandias, the last remnants of the once great Shan-Shan Empire, a lone ruined statue with a faded inscription. My name is Fortuona, King of Kings. Look at my works, ye mighty in despair. Stories can be updated to become more relevant to people with new sensibilities. I'm not just talking about matters of representation and diversity, such as remaking an old movie with a more racially diverse cast. I'm not talking about that either, but also about references, descriptions, and even deep matters of cultural meaning. The people in the Wheel of Time do not see dragons as great fire-breathing lizards with wings, but they know that a dragon is powerful and dangerous, wondrous and special, a force for good or evil, but always destructive change to be feared. You know you're in an epic story when a dragon shows up. Our character names are frequently taken from King Arthur and his associates, but in most cases their stories are very different from their namesake or inspiration. Rand has many similarities to King Arthur, but so does Arthur Hawkwing, and neither of them had an accidental incest child with Morgase. Galad is certainly pure of heart, but at the very least he's definitely held Berelain's hand. And my guess is that she's not going to wait long at all before ruining Galad's chance at finding the Sangreal. Still, even though Galad's story has little resemblance to Galahad's, if you had to pick out one character from the Wheel of Time that had to be Galahad, you'd pick Galad, even if he was named Jimmy. A pious knight by any other name would still probably be a pain in Elaine's ass. Of course, time isn't the only threshold that meaning can cross. Distance, culture, gender, any difference in perspective. Our own perspective is always inherently, by definition, limited. We can only see what we can see. But we can also hear about what others have seen and imagine how they felt or how we would feel in their circumstances. It likely won't come as a surprise that I have never been to outer space. I don't even like to fly, but I can find pictures of our planet taken by astronauts in moments. We all can. Seeing pictures of the Earth from space may awaken different meanings for all of us. A challenge to overcome, a precious garden to protect, a great business opportunity. If it were me in a ship beyond the Earth's atmosphere, I think I would just see home. I wonder what Rand must have felt, wrestling with Shaitan outside of the pattern, to walk through a recreation of Camelin knowing that he might never return to his Camelin in reality. We can imagine what someone else felt like while staring down at the Earth from space, but we can't truly know for sure. We can't even know what we would have felt in their position. I do believe in such a thing as objective truth, but it's a very tiny fraction of truth as a whole. You would hardly see it as more than a speck if you placed the objective truth alongside all subjective truths. We can all agree whether it's raining outside, at a specific time and location, but what does that mean? I love the rain. I love storms and shade. Clear days give me a sunburn and bore me to tears. Rain reminds me of other rainy days, particularly when I used to go on long walks during rough Wisconsin storms. One time I was in a storm so bad that the wind picked me up off the ground. I couldn't see more than a foot in any direction, and I had to hold onto a lamppost to stay on the ground and not get blown away. I should have been terrified, but it was just thrilling. Over time, what little fear I probably had at the time has faded from my memory, and now I only remember the excitement. My puppy seems to hate the rain, but he can't tell me why. He's very small and fluffy. Maybe he just doesn't like getting all wet and muddy. Maybe it reminds him of getting a bath, and he really hates that. Just thinking of a hypothetical rainstorm, I could go on for probably hours about what rain means to me and what I think it might mean to my puppy or anyone else in the world. I'm not even a meteorologist or a hydrologist. I suppose a professional could tell me that there's actually a lot more objective truth to rain than I'm giving it credit for. They could probably go on for days talking about what they know about rain, or even what just one storm could teach us about the sky, the land, and the sea. All things that might be true, but aren't really about any particular storm, and all filtered through the subjectivity of a single human perspective. The distance between two people under the same rain cloud may seem small, but the distance between their perspectives is as vast as that between planets. The same could be said of all truths. The most powerful and destructive truth in the Wheel of Time is the story of the Aiel. Walking through the Pillars of Meridian alongside Muradin, we see how the same truth can affect two people differently. Rand saw the truth of Chattin and the destiny of the Aiel. Muradin tore out his eyes, veiled himself, and succumbed to it. This isn't because Rand was strong and Muradin was weak. It's because the truth of the Aiel meant entirely different things to them. The threshold of culture filtered away the unbearable aspects for Rand, allowing him to see the parts of truth that pertain to his destiny rather than that of the Aiel's personal story. Even the Aiel who support him note how recklessly and unempathetically he forced this terrible truth onto all of the Aiel. He really didn't understand the true depth of what it meant to them. The result of the difference between Rand and Muradin tore the Aiel into factions, allowing Savannah, an obviously terrible leader, the opportunity to seize control of the Shido. The truth of Chattin and the terrible actions of the ancient Aes Sedai were always part of the truth of Meridian, but that wasn't the important part for the Aiel that went there. That truth waited until Rand discovered it, because it was more important to him, purely based on his different perspective. Sometimes stories change by accident, as in a signal degrading. Sometimes they change on purpose, as new storytellers impart their own interpretations and creations. Then, sometimes the storyteller was merely inspired, and had no intention to retell the story in the same way. Ma Elainer has almost nothing to do with, bear with me here, I'm going to try to say it right, Mjolnir. It's really hard to say. I'm just going to say Mjolnir. Other than the name and that they're both hammers. But you can see how Perrin's awesome hammer was inspired by Mjolnir, even if there's no deeper connection. I'm doing my best here. I really am. All right, I hate to do a costume change like mid-section, but I vastly underestimated how hot that hoodie and these lights were going to get over talking for a while. So, all right, where was I? I was talking about Mjolnir. I can't do it. Anyways, moving on. In the Wheel of Time, there are also numerous references to the power and unreliability of rumor. Some characters wield rumor intentionally for propaganda. Rand often finds himself the victim of both intentional propaganda and simple misunderstanding. Berylaine's cruel game with Perrin, spreading rumors that they slept together after Fael was taken, caused him a great deal of distress. In these cases, the original modification of meaning between the original facts and the audience is very intentional. It's lying, but close enough to the truth to mislead, either by convincing people of the real story or simply by providing enough doubt for each individual to adhere to what they already wanted to believe. Of course, this isn't an ethical or uplifting example of how meaning changes across thresholds, but it's certainly effective. It's a tool, for good or for evil. Even Berylane misjudged how her rumors would affect Perrin and the people of the Two Rivers, not understanding the cultural difference between her and them, thinking that Perrin would kind of just shrug it off and it wouldn't reflect poorly on him. Throughout the last battle, several characters tell lies to bolster morale. Lan claims that he doesn't mourn for the fallen, he cheers. Tam says they'll go back for their bows later. Loyal still plans to finish his book, running out to watch Lan's fall so he can document it, knowing that he likely won't survive the hour himself. There was no harm to such a little lie. Perhaps some people believe the lies, but more simply choose to share in them, preferring them to the truth. Through communal effort, the lie can even become truth. The Borderlanders truly do cheer the fallen, laughing as they recount stories of great heroism. The last words of the series come from Loyal's book. How often do characters from other cultures misunderstand one another in the Wheel of Time? Even in a world with only one language, we can still see regional dialects and different modes of thinking. Wetlanders struggle to understand the humor in Aiel jokes, just as Aiel struggle to understand how a person could be so irresponsible as to actually bathe in water. As Aviendha thinks to herself, that couldn't be healthy. We see how prophecies and stories of Rand are different in each culture. He who comes with the dawn will destroy the Aiel, leaving only a remnant of a remnant, yet he will also lead them to meet their ancestral toe. The Dragon Reborn will break and save the world. His symbol represents suspicion and the shadow, and his existence brings dread, yet he's also a savior. No one truly sees him for what he is, other than Min, but none of them are entirely wrong either. They each see him as they need to see him. It's not really about him anyways. As information changes across each dimension of movement, we can see that whether the change is good or bad is inherently subjective. The Aiel may not like how some Cairienin have come to adopt their own version of Jie-To, but the philosophy is plainly beneficial to many city people, particularly women, who lacked a cultural framework to see themselves as being capable of responding to the changing world around them and rising to meet it confidently and even aggressively, ironically interpreting Aiel culture in a way that has them proudly wearing swords in place of spears. They took what they needed from Aiel culture and ignored what they didn't. You could see this as cultural appropriation, or you could see it as a respectful interpretation of the Aiel's at times superior culture by Wetlanders who truly do look up to the Aiel, but come from a culture that reveres swords as the highest class of weapon a person can use on foot. They cling to these swords as firmly as the Aiel eschew them, even after learning the truth that they were never meant to wield spears as weapons either. The distinction between spear and sword is completely different to modern Aiel than what it would have been to the ancient Aiel. These Wetlanders were dealing with a great trauma. The world was changing around them and they didn't feel ready for it. Many people lost family and friends to the Shaido in the Second Battle of Cairien and had to come to terms not only with that sudden loss, but also with the humiliation of being saved by other Aiel. Their lives came to be dominated by factions of the Aiel. For some, certain aspects of Aiel culture provided a perspective that helped with processing these complex and upsetting emotions. The Tuathan, the Tinkers, are yet another side of the Aiel, adhering more firmly to the Aiel's ancient way of life than those who continue to call themselves Aiel. If all Aiel had maintained the way of the leaf, then the world would have fallen to Shaitan. If all Aiel had gone the way of the spear, there would have been no living memory of the way of the leaf in the world. Not one truth, but many, shaped by various metaphorical distances. In Perrin's relationship with Faile, he frequently struggled with her expectation that he would be assertive or even aggressive with her. She could tell that Perrin was bottling up his feelings and trying to deal with disputes through compromise, or even by simply capitulating to what he thought she wanted. That's not generally a good long-term relationship strategy. It certainly wasn't going to work for Faile. She prefers to discuss things outright, taking comfort and pleasure in the passion and commitment that honest emotions bring forth. Yet, with Perrin's position in the world changing so dramatically around him, the most tender moment we see between the two is when Faile makes an effort to make Perrin feel comfortable with a simple outdoor picnic, based on advice from a man from Edmund's Field. If not for learning to communicate more honestly with Faile, could Perrin have learned to be confident about himself and his identity as a man and a wolf? We could go even deeper, asking whether Perrin's overabundance of caution in speaking with Faile came from the pain of losing his family and not wanting to lose yet another person he cares about. Learning to trust that not only can Faile take care of herself, but even if she can't, a relationship simply can't survive if it's built on a fear of losing it, is an important part of Perrin's growth. Not just because he needed to help Rand before looking for Faile during the last battle, but so the two of them could have a healthy future together. The thresholds of Aiel and Wetlander, male and female, Saldean and Two Rivers Inn, us and them, bring us to our third theme, duality and non-duality. Alright, so the cyclical nature of time is baked right into the title of the series and the first paragraph of each chapter 1. The changing of meaning across time, space, culture, etc. also comes up repeatedly throughout the series. But if you had to explain how the Wheel of Time is different from other fantasy series, Robert Jordan's take on gender is probably the first thing you'd mention, right? Well, unless you were fine with giving away spoilers, which we'll get to in just a little bit. We're introduced to the Women's Circle and the Village Council in the very first chapter of the series. The names seem to indicate that the men's group is the main one simply because it doesn't need a gender qualifier. As we so often see in our time, male is the default. Yet from what we see, it appears that the two groups are normally matched in power, or perhaps the Women's Circle even has a little bit of an upper hand, at least when the wisdom isn't so young. Regardless of which, if either is superior, we're introduced to the struggle between the two almost immediately, long before we learn almost anything else about the world of the Wheel of Time. In that same chapter, we also see a bit of how young boys and girls interact, with Matt and Dav planning to set an angry badger loose on the green so they can watch the girls run. We quickly learn that the women in Edmund's field feel that Tam needs a woman because, quote, it was a simple fact that a man just could not do without a woman to take care of him and keep him out of trouble. One of the most interesting aspects of the series, in my view, is how gender norms are different in different cultures. The world as a whole seems to slant just a little bit towards female chauvinism, but most cultures aren't true matriarchies, except for maybe Farmatting. We see imbalances, such as Ebudar marriages, but we also see a male king take the throne after Thailand dies. We see that in most cultures, even cultures that generally respect the Aes Sedai, men don't trust them while women do. There are more female soldiers than in our history, but soldiers in the Wheel of Time are primarily male, and even maidens of the spear need to give up the spear while pregnant and leave Fardaris Mai altogether if they marry. All of our great captains are male. The most powerful regent in the wetlands is a queen, and the most powerful empire is headed by an empress, but many of the regents we meet are male. The dragon is male, and except for just one thought in A Memory of Light, Chattin is always described using male pronouns. This isn't a world dominated by women. It's a world where the balance between masculine and feminine is just a little bit askew, just like in our time. But unlike in our time, the scales shift just a little bit in favor of women, and the manner of this imbalance is different in each culture, which again is similar to how things work in the real world. The Borderlanders are particularly interesting to me, in that they hold protective views towards women that we would associate with male chauvinism, but they also seem to sincerely hold women as more important than men. This seems inspired by the Southern and military culture that Robert Jordan was familiar with, but spun in a slightly different light. Discussing this in either the Wheel of Time or the real world is very complicated. Does holding a door for a woman or offering her your seat demonstrate male chauvinism? The belief that men are inherently superior to women and thus women need extra help? It's similar to how we treat children, isn't it? Offering them extra support because they need it? But it's also how lower class people treat higher class people. So are women children compared to men, or are they nobility among commoners? When it comes to war or dangerous jobs, we seem to agree that men are far more expendable, yet when it comes to childbirth and bodily autonomy, a popular religious movement wields immense global political power towards the goal of making women expendable. For both progressives and conservatives, it's immensely difficult to agree on whether men and women are the same, or if they even should be the same. Socially, even the notion that sex and gender aren't an immutable one-to-one mapping is hotly debated, despite the overwhelming medical and scientific consensus that they are not. The Wheel of Time doesn't have any easy answers to these questions. How could it? If Robert Jordan had known how to solve these problems, I would like to think that he would have done so in a more direct way than working the answer into a fantasy series. What the series does provide are different perspectives to consider gender in different lights. For example, I pointed out in many places where many of our coolest female characters are really kind of chauvinist, arrogant, and selfish. Certainly more so than most of our male characters. Yet, are we, as readers, more tolerant of arrogance from male characters than female characters in stories we read? Would I have noted how frustrating Egwene is compared to Rand if their genders were reversed? I would very much like to think so, but it's a question I'm going to carry with me into everything I read in the future. I'm not wrong about Egwene, but it is possible I've been wrong about many other characters without even realizing it. I almost feel like I don't even need to mention Saidar and Saidin or the Black and White Towers. A bird cannot teach a fish to fly, nor a fish teach a bird to swim. Of course, as Varen points out, there are birds that dive and swim, and in the Sea of Storms, there are fish that fly. Which brings us to the true point here. Is gender truly a duality? Is this theme about duality or non-duality? Now, before we get into this, I do need to at least briefly touch on maybe one of the touchiest aspects of the Wheel of Time, the existence of trans and non-binary people. We have exactly one trans character in the Wheel of Time that we know about, and they aren't really the best representation. I don't just mean that Erengar is a villain, but that they're only trans because of a fantasy element of the series. You could take Erengar as a statement that gender is a matter of the soul, which is why Erengar still channels Saidin. But you could also take this as a statement that being trans is unnatural, literally coming from the source of all evil. We don't really have any non-binary characters at all. The notions of Saidar and Saidin even seem to imply that there's no such thing as being non-binary in the Wheel of Time, though I think this is somewhat debatable, as you could consider the ability to channel either Saidar or Saidin as just one aspect of a person, which could debatably actually make Erengar NB, though I don't really feel like this is a strong position to take for Erengar in particular, and I'd be kind of surprised if any MB readers found validation or representation in this character. Though if anyone watching did find representation in Arengar, I would actually love to hear so in a comment. Like, maybe it's just my own limited perspective and I'm missing something significant. But maybe the bar was just low enough in 1994 when Lord of Chaos was published for Arengar to just barely clear it. But in any case, I really think that Robert Jordan just didn't consider trans or non-binary people when writing. Given his age and when he started writing these books, I don't think this was a deliberate attempt to exclude anyone or make a political point. I really get the impression that he just wasn't really aware of this and was just writing from his own limited experience with gender. Maybe he addressed this in an interview or something, but regardless, I think the most productive thing we can do is to just treat the series as a product of its time and consider the duality of gender in more abstract terms, not as necessarily corresponding to the literal facts of sex and gender in real life, but as the masculine and feminine as perspectives. It's already a fantasy world after all. Perhaps the lack of trans and non-binary people is no different from the ability to channel or the Rockin', or maybe it's even the result of the tainting of Chattin. I don't think this was intentional, but I can imagine the rough sketch of an interpretation of the Wheel of Time as specifically showing how the world is thrown into disarray when we treat gender as immutable and binary. And in some ways, this reduction actually helps us to reason about gender and duality by focusing on one limited dimension. The Wheel of Time also lacks a diversity of language and religion, but I don't think this was really meant as a social statement or an unintentional omission either, but just that Jordan wanted to focus on differences in culture and belief within a limited context. As I've mentioned before, the fact that everyone we ever meet in the Wheel of Time shares the same religious worldview actually serves to emphasize, for example, the beliefs of the Children of the Light. If they had simply had different religious beliefs, different gods, and different concept of the universe and life after death, then we would have lost some of the nuance to how they relate to the rest of the world. In the same way, by locking down gender to just one limited binary, we turn up the contrast a bit so we can see the differences and similarities more clearly. But back to our point. Even without considering MB people, the Wheel of Time forces us to consider whether gender is a duality or a non-duality, and whether it can be both, the non-duality of duality and non-duality. This is our real theme here. Men and women are different. Saidar and Chattin are different. The village council and the women's circle are different. The wise ones and the clan chiefs are different. But they're only whole when taken together, and they aren't as different as they seem. Separate sides, but also a continuation and union of each. Consider the running gag that pretty much everyone in the Wheel of Time thinks that the opposite gender is prone to gossip. Pretty much everyone feels that the opposite gender is irrational, unable to see past their emotions. Though this is played as a joke, it really does aid our theme here. Even across a true duality, one that's reflected in the physical laws of Saidar and Chattin, the other side looks much the same as your own side, just seen from the other side. Imagine Elaine or Nynaeve standing alone in a room with a mirror, unwilling to say her thoughts aloud for fear that the reflection, like Matt, would just screw things up if she knew what the plan was. So long as the two sides are in balance and in communication or continuation with one another, there is a sense of goodness. When they cut themselves off from one another or one grows in relative power, there's a sense of badness. Compare the relation between men and women for the Aiel compared to everywhere else that we see. You couldn't find an Aiel man who would only trust a wise one who could channel so long as she was restrained by the oaths. Neither could you find a wise one who would need them to prevent her from dominating men. Well, except for Savannah, who notably could not channel. When the Shido break away from the rest of the Aiel, Savannah attempts to rule as both a man and a woman, leading only to disaster. Even the wise ones who enabled and supported her saw the evil in this aspect of what she was doing. I still find it interesting that it was Nynaeve who explained to Egwene that when the Aes Sedai cut themselves off from the world, they risk arrogance. It would seem that, for all the lessons Egwene learned from the Aiel, she didn't manage to generalize the lesson of the non-duality of duality and non-duality. We could get very abstract and philosophical with this concept, but I think it's actually pretty intuitive as long as we don't try to push it too far. Consider Perrin and Fael. They are different people, not just in that they're literally two people, but in that they have very different personalities. Yet, Perrin very literally defines his core self. His truest notion of home is Fael. It's what allows him to maintain a sense of self in the dream, and it's what enables him to break free from Lanfear's compulsion. When the two of them were apart, he fell to pieces. Fael, on the other hand, actually found a greater sense of self while in Malden, learning the responsibility of leadership. Yet, upon being reunited, they both prioritize reconnecting with one another. Though she can stand alone, she chooses to form a couple with Perrin. Her time in Malden strengthened her as a person, but this strength didn't diminish the benefit the union brings them in the slightest. And don't get too hung up on gender either. Gender is definitely the most obvious form of duality in the Wheel of Time, but Is this the only difference between Perrin and Fail? Or more pointedly, is this the only duality we can come up for Perrin, the man who is also a wolf? Several of our characters have an internal duality. Perrin and Elias are men and wolves. Isam and Luke share a single physical presence. We could push this even further, seeing Matt as a gambler and a warrior, a lover and a fighter, a commoner and a prince. Nynaeve begins the series in the role of a mother to the Emmons Fielders, but eventually comes to literally call Egwene mother. While in the White Tower under Elaida, Egwene was both a prisoner and an Amyrlin. Ped and Fane is just all sorts of people. For each of these characters, their two sides are distinct, but it's the emergent unity of them that forms the character. Learning to see both sides as part of themselves, drawing support from both, comprises some of our most important character arcs. And this brings us, finally, back to how I started this section. If you had to describe how the Wheel of Time is unique without any major spoilers, you'd talk about gender. If you didn't mind spoilers, you'd probably talk about Rand and Lews Therin. I already talked about this in the section on Cyclical Time, but it's such an important part of both Rand's arc and the series as a whole that it bears examining not merely from two perspectives, but also from two meta perspectives. Consider that, just as Rand and Lews Therin oppose one another in Rand's body, so too do the wounds from Chattin and Shatter Logoth. The duality of those wounds is what inspires Rand to cleanse Chattin by leveraging their mutual animosity. Note that they are both evils. They're both on the evil side of the duality between good and evil, yet they also oppose one another, to their mutual destruction. Imagine how powerful evil would have grown if Chattin and Shatter Logoth hadn't rejected unity. Or maybe we don't have to imagine. Whereas the two evils never see that they are truly one, the two great goods within Rand and Lews Therin, do come to understand this. And in so doing, they form the awakened Rand, who is both separate from Lews Therin and a continuation of him. The man who defeats Chattin, gaining the power to extinguish evil from the world forever. Yet, in his enlightenment, Rand sees that even good and evil, light and shadow, form a monad. He sees that the emergence of free will arises specifically from the non-duality of good and evil. Note that, for all the fantasy elements at play here, the critical moment of the entire series occurs at the top of Dragonmount. This isn't really a magical or supernatural moment. Rand didn't learn a new weave or secret tactic to defeat Chattin in that moment. He merely accepted that what he had seen as a duality was really a continuation. We see, for example, with Andral and Pavara, or with Rand and Nynaeve, how powerful the supernatural unity of Saidar and Saiden can be, but the scene on Dragonmount really emphasizes that this isn't just a bit of fantasy world building. This is a worldview that we can take with us into the real world. Like with the cyclical nature of time and the changing of meaning over distance, duality is about perspective. Our perspectives are precious, but so is the understanding that our perspectives are all different angles of the same greater truth. The key isn't to merely see things from another point of view, but to realize that it's seeing things from multiple points of view together that brings deeper understanding. It's like the parable of the blind men and the mysterious animal. A group of blind men heard that a strange animal had been brought to town. They decided to go touch it to figure out what it is. They each touched a different part of the animal. One felt a snake, another felt a fan, a tree trunk, a wall, a rope, lastly a spear. The story has multiple endings depending on the telling, but only when you put all the pieces together do you discover an elephant, with its snake-like trunk, fan-like ears, wall-like sides, rope-like tail, and spear-like tusks. Some of the best aspects of our most inspiring characters come from them reaching outside of their perspective. Tam is a good father because he is nurturing and supportive. This doesn't make him less of a man. Being a father is about being more than simply being a man. In fact, even being a good man is about more than being purely masculine. You need the drop of yin and the yang. Egwene responds to Gawain's death in much the same way that a warder does for losing their Aes Sedai. She doesn't spend weeks moping around, she grows furious and throws herself back into the fight without a care for her own safety. Being the Amyrlin is about more than being Aes Sedai or a good woman. She's also, by the way, has a specific strength for Earthweaves, which is generally a masculine trait. Being a good woman is about more than being purely feminine. It's only after Rand realizes that he is a continuation of Lews Therin, coming to see himself as more than 400 years old, that he finds it in himself to go to his father like a child, crying openly and apologizing for everything terrible that he's done. As C.S. Lewis commented on 1 Corinthians 13:11, "When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to appear very grown up." When we look at the world from only our perspective, adhering to duality and eschewing the love, empathy, and charity that binds duality into non-duality, it's as though we're looking at the world through a glass, darkly, seeing only our own reflection. Embrace the oneness between the self and the other, the here and the now, and then be whole. So, all right, I've defined our 3 abstract themes, and I've mentioned both C.S. Lewis and the first epistle to the Corinthians, so I think we're finally ready for the main theme of the Wheel of Time. Though there's a lot more to the series than just one theme, if we have to pick one primary theme that explains the entire series, and we do, if only because I'm making us, then the series exists as a work of Christian apologetics dealing with the problem of evil. It is also, equivalently, a guide to personally getting over trauma and moving on with our lives. To a person living with a Christian worldview, like Robert Jordan, these 2 concepts are identical. To a person who lived through the hell of war, like Robert Jordan, these 2 concepts are of utmost importance. Just as a quick reminder, this whole section of the video is about the worldview of the Wheel of Time as I believe it was written. I'll offer my personal thoughts on all of this once we've finished analyzing it for what it is. Christian apologetics is a large branch of Christian theology that aims to defend and bolster the faith. From the outside, this may appear strange. Why defend a faith at all? If the faith needs defending, then why hold it? But apologetics actually takes a transformative role in Christian theology. Even the Pauline epistles, a huge fraction of the New Testament, are, in a way, a form of Christian apologetics. In this way, Christian apologetics are similar to, say, the Jewish Talmud, a long-term study of Scripture and the world debated logically between theologians, which build up a commentary to expand sacred Scripture without the need for new prophets. See, for most Christian denominations, the set of Scripture that's considered canon is closed. You cannot write a new book of the Bible, at least not without creating a new denomination, if not a new religion altogether. Different denominations have different rules regarding what is included in biblical canon, but most branches of Christianity agree, in general, that the New Testament is formed of writings from those close to the apostles. Some denominations believe that people today may still receive the gift of prophecy, while others hold that there's been a degree of cessation in divine gifts. But even if you receive the gift of prophecy, you can't really write a new book of the Bible. To expand the set of Christian literature within a single denomination, you basically have 2 options. Write a devotional, which is a more experiential, personal, and emotional work, or write some apologetics, focusing on a logical or even legal interpretation of existing scripture and dogma. As you might imagine, this is far more complex than I could describe briefly, with differences in opinion both within and between denominations. This also isn't unique to Christians, but a common concept for Abrahamic religion in general. Judaism holds that Malachi is the last biblical prophet, and that the next time the world sees prophets, they will come with the Messiah, which means anointed one, which is also what Christ means, as Christians believe that Jesus is that Messiah. Islam holds that Judaism and Christianity have lost their way. The faiths were, after all, the result of a long period of oral traditions and scattered writings without a single unbroken source. And Muhammad is the last prophet sent by Allah not to create a new religion, but to restore the original Islam bestowed upon Adam, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and the other prophets of old. The Latter-day Saint movement is particularly notable for being a Christian denomination with a new book of scripture. So again, this is more complicated than I expressed without derailing the entire video more than I already have here. But anyways, the super high-level takeaway here is that Abrahamic religions generally do not allow additions or modifications to scripture. So when believers find an apparent flaw in the scripture, or when scripture and existing dogma fail to address a situation, there's a need to create new meaning through interpretation of the existing scripture. We call it apologetics, but it's very similar to how courts in a judicial system set precedent for new law without new legislation. Amending a constitution is generally very difficult, so when a new situation arises, courts make an effort to address the situation by interpreting existing law and legal precedent. Right now, courts across the world are scrambling to do just this for recent developments in AI. In the US, there's been a major recent push to achieve conservative goals granting the state power over individual bodily autonomy through judicial action. Similarly, apologetics help to both respond to new situations due to the changing world and in reconciling changes of worldview. At their worst, apologetics can be used to argue for harmful dogma or to excuse atrocities. But at their best, apologetics can also be a form of introspection and self-help, a way to reason logically about challenges in our own lives, a way to answer the question, why has God done this to me? Which brings us, at long last, to the core meaning of the Wheel of Time. Quote, "The Creator had made the world and then left humankind to make of it what they would, a heaven or the pit of doom by their choosing. The Creator had made many worlds, watched each flower die, and gone on to make endless worlds beyond. A gardener did not weep for each blossom that fell. I am the dragon reborn," Rand roared at Chattin, at Tam, at Cat Swan, at the Creator himself. "I will not be your pawn." He was angry at the world, angry at the pattern, angry at the Creator for leaving humans to fight against the Dark One with no direction. What right did any of them have to demand Rand's life of him? Why? Why must they do this over and over? The world could give him no answers. Rand raised his arms high, a conduit of power and energy, an incarnation of death and destruction. He would end it all and let men rest, finally from their suffering, stop them from having to live over and over again. Why? Why had the Creator done this to them? Why? These are all quotes from Rand, but there are many more thoughts like this throughout the series. Even Fael, in one moment of frustration, asks herself, why had the Creator made people as perfect as Berlain? Was it mockery of the rest of them? We are told explicitly in the glossary that Chattin is, quote, the source of evil, antithesis of the Creator. As Rand and Chattin fight, the Dark One refers to Rand primarily as adversary, a clear reference to the original Hebrew word Satan, which is occasionally used in the Old Testament to refer to human adversaries. For an example of this, look at 1 Samuel 29:4. Find the word adversary, then look at the Hebrew text. A being of personified, egotistical evil named the Satan actually doesn't show up much in the Bible, except for in the book of Job and Zechariah. Consolidating the Satan, Lucifer, the devil, etc. into the single figure we now think of is a matter of dogma, rather than something you would naturally infer while reading the books of the Bible. Though most Christians today believe that God alone created the world, there is even historical debate over the potential role of an antithesis in the process of creation. The Wheel of Time doesn't give Chattin any credit for the act of creation, making it clear that Chattin was imprisoned by the Creator at the moment of creation in a prison at Shia Ghul. Whether Chattin existed before this creation or if Chattin was created too at the moment of creation, created and imprisoned in the same moment, is never really addressed. Not that it really matters for our characters. What does matter is that Chattin, as the embodiment of evil, has existed for all of creation, always bound but always there. The Dark One cannot step into the world, but it can and does influence it. Even without the Boar, even without the ability to directly touch the pattern and influence it, Chattin influences the world through the actions of humans. The climax of the series is when Rand sits atop Dragon Mount and realizes that a life filled with evil is still valuable. The climax of A Memory of Light expands on this, as Rand realizes life isn't merely worthwhile despite evil, but it wouldn't truly be life without it. Evil is a requirement for free will. In his too perfect world, life continues to exist, but it loses its flavor, its spark. We need to be tested in order to grow, and a test is only meaningful if the consequences are real. We see an echo of this in Nynaeve's test for the shawl. In her wisdom, she cannot forget that the test is not real. It's just a test. In her wisdom, she also decides that this doesn't make her actions any less important. To the contrary, it only strengthens her resolve to do what she knows is right, rather than selfishly pursuing the test as a test. She refuses to walk calmly when she could do more good by running. She will even use forbidden weaves in the service of good. I think we can see this as a metaphor for living with a belief in an afterlife. If this world is a test and heaven is more real, do you live your life by meticulously following the rules of this world in order to earn your reward in the next? Or does a true sense of ethics, real integrity, encourage a good person to do what's right without a care for passing the test? After Nynaeve's test, the Aes Sedai fret over what to do about her failure, while she, as an enlightened woman, appreciates the lesson that the test taught her about herself. It wasn't about passing, but about learning. The three perspectives we've been talking about are useful tools for growth, but a perspective is only worth something if there's something to focus it on. In a world without evil, what impetus would there be for growth? This is the realization Rand has, holding Chattin in his hands, preparing to destroy it forever. It's a vile, hateful thing, but humanity needs it to give ourselves meaning. But we also need goodness. We need to experience both to learn how to eschew evil and pursue good. We see this in every major character arc throughout the series. I've already mentioned several in just this video, and I couldn't enumerate them all without basically just re-summarizing the entire series. But I suppose I should offer at least some examples here. I'm really just picking these as I come to mind, as almost any character arc would work here. Logain was once hated and feared for being able to channel. He found that he could only accomplish anything in the world while being feared. Yet, when he sees that the refugees he saved look at him with different eyes than those who once hated and feared him, he puts that prejudice behind him. The Black Tower protects. Always. A great evil, the treatment of men who can channel, harmed Logain and tested him. His madness caused him to fear that he would lose the ability to channel again, and so he must seize all the power he can to protect himself. Then, the evil of the Trollocs attacking the refugees made him choose: abandon goodness to pursue the power to protect himself, or risk weakness, let himself be vulnerable to do something good. What's the major difference between Time and Logain? When Logain was at his lowest point, he was shown a glimmer of goodness. Though he was filled with rage and fear on a path toward evil, he was shown a degree of trust. Min saw that he would achieve greatness. The Asha'man trusted that he would lead them. Time, meanwhile, received only hatred and fear from Rand and from the world. Time was never caught and gentled and never learned what it was to be powerless and shown mercy. Logain learned to see beyond himself. He learned to see what it was like to be truly helpless, reliant on others for protection. He saw that a person can choose whether to give in to fear or whether to risk trust. He learned how it feels to receive mercy, and thus he learned how to give it. Both Logain and Time saw the world in a duality between men who can channel and everyone else. But Logain, through the suffering of being gentled, learned to see past this duality, to see that the taint does not define him. Yes, he can channel, but he can choose how, just as those who cannot channel can choose how to see him. Time never suffered this pain, never grew, and died very much as he was when we first met him. We see a similar progression for Rand and Egwene and their imprisonment by the Aes Sedai and the Shan-Shan. The experiences risk twisting them both towards fear and hate of others who imprisoned them, but they also both come to see that not all Shan-Shan and not all Aes Sedai are the same. The duality between Egwene and the Shan-Shan, between Rand and the Aes Sedai, does not define them. Egwene learns to trust Leolwyn despite being Shan-Shan, while still opposing Fortuona, not merely as a Shan-Shan, but on specific principles. Rand learns to trust even Kedsuan, while also acknowledging her mistakes and the mistakes of her sisters. After all, he made mistakes too. How can he forgive himself without also forgiving those who have wronged him? Consider Rand and Moradin. They both came to see existence itself as misery, but Moradin fails to see existence through the lens of the cyclical nature of time. His immortality blinds him to the joy of existence. Moradin is still the same man he was in the prologue, the same man he was in the Age of Legends. He tastes death, but not rebirth, being transmigrated with his consciousness intact. Rand, on the other hand, experiences true death and rebirth. He finds new loves, new joys, and new reasons for existing. Through the pain of killing his family and the joy of finding a new one, he sees that life is not static, but ever-changing. Though we suffer in loss, we rejoice in new life. Moradin does not suffer this loss, and thus he doesn't learn how to move past it. For Moradin, time stands still. Of course he hates existence. Consider Morghese. Her fall from being the greatest queen on the continent to a lowly servant and her abuse at the hands of the White Cloaks was terrible. What kept her strong through it? Sure, she's tough, she's hard, but as we saw with Rand and Egwene, hardness alone isn't sufficient. Instead, she came to appreciate the nobility in serving. She discovered that serving tea is a delicate art that she never properly appreciated before, as intricate and challenging as many of her duties as queen. Learning to see the meaning across the metaphorical distance between classes helped her live with her humiliation, finding a sense of purpose where she would have previously seen none. Even after being revealed as Morghese and being reunited with Elaine, we see that Morghese retains the sense of respect for the simple art of serving tea, and likely a greater respect for her servants as a whole. We can see how evil encourages growth in each character just as we see it in the big, broad themes, such as the Aiel's evolving views on violence. The ancient Aiel followed the way of the leaf, then come to follow Jie-To, warring with one another. In the Fourth Age, they will use their strength and violence to prevent violence by upholding the dragon's peace. Over generations, across cultural boundaries, and through shifting views of self versus other, the Aiel grow into the world's stabilizing force. Yet, they must still remain vigilant. Life and growth are never finished, and the wise ones and chiefs will continue to steer their people in the right direction. When Rand and Elaine talk together, Rand explains that the pattern is balance, neither good nor evil. She asks him, if what you say is true, then there can never be good in the world. Though at this point, Rand hasn't fully realized the truth that Chattin is a necessary part of the world, he responds, so long as we care, there can be good. The world presents us with both good and evil. It's our choice whether to embrace the good or give in to evil. That choice itself is what gives the results meaning. So that's it. That's the main theme of the Wheel of Time. With that in mind, now I finally want to talk about my own personal thoughts on the ending. And to be perfectly honest, my initial reaction upon finishing A Memory of Light was to throw the book down and say out loud, this book fucking sucks. For a good few days, I was honestly a little depressed. This series was so good. I spent all this time talking about it and thinking about it. I don't know if it's apparent just how much time I've been spending on these videos. It's a lot. I could have probably written my own book by now. Hundreds of thousands of words written and edited. Hundreds of hours spent in research and discussing ideas with friends. All of that investment in a fantasy series. And Chattin is just the devil? Sanderson threw in phrases like, it screams were the sounds of planets grinding together, and the repeated imagery of dark chthonic tentacles. Chattin's speech is in all caps, but ultimately, there really wasn't any novel element to Chattin. In a series filled with references to a variety of religions and myths, the references to other dimensions and stars, why does Chattin have a personal ego at all? If I'd written the ending of the Wheel of Time, Chattin would have been truly incomprehensible, alien. Or at the very least, like Sauron, I just wouldn't have had him show up as a character with an ego and a personality. Fane was even worse. I mean, my God. Just Matt having survived the evil of the dagger in order to kill Shai-Sam didn't mean anything. I mean, he survived the evil of the dagger and grew to be immune to it, I guess, but there wasn't any actual character growth there. It's all lore with no deeper meaning. Matt was never stupid enough to pick up the dagger if he'd known how terrible it was. He hasn't really learned to be any more cautious or respectful or anything. And Fane himself just didn't really go anywhere. There were so many directions Fane could have gone, blending what we know of Mordeth with the evil of Shai-Tam. Whereas the two wounds on Rand's side maintain their duality, Fane could have shown what happens when a servant of Shai-Tam, twisted and changed by him, merges with the evil of Shadar-Logoth. He even had an encounter with Mashin Shin in the Ways, potentially adding yet another mysterious, extra-dimensional evil to the pot. But nope, he was just Mordeth resolidifying into Mashadar again, simply moving Shadar-Logoth into a new location. Fane's personality is entirely gone. There's no last encounter with Rand or Shai-Tam. Even Perrin doesn't get to do anything about Fane having killed his family. Why even bother having Perrin find out that Fane killed his family if it never matters at all? And the bit where Swan and Brynn split up, I mean, why? Swan has lived nearly half of her life at this point focused on prophecy, understanding that it's never quite as simple as it seems. They could have just asked Min if the vision was still there. Brynn didn't even have a good reason to leave her side. He was her warder. Why split them up? Brynn couldn't even be trusted to give advice. What good was he as a simple warder separated from his Aes Sedai? Even if not for the vision, why split up on a battlefield? The warder bond is a tremendous boon, but it comes with a major risk in that if either person is killed, the other is incapacitated by it. Staying near your Aes Sedai has got to be literally the most important part of being a warder. It just didn't make any sense. It felt like it was in the book completely arbitrarily. Like, I could go on like this. Honestly, part of me wants to. Fail's portrayal in A Memory of Light was terrible. Everything she does technically makes a kind of sense, but the telling just makes her look like a paranoid fool. I mean, I get it. She had every reason to suspect a dark friend in her group. If anything, she was too trusting and only considering people she didn't know personally. But what we actually experience is that Fail is just constantly scared, doesn't really know what's going on, and only really gets one even halfway heroic scene in the whole damn book. Part of me wants to praise this for being somewhat realistic. Robert Jordan often did things like this, having characters fall flat rather than shine as heroes. But A Memory of Light is also, frankly, kind of over the top when it comes to heroics compared to the rest of the series. The battles are too cool. Robert Jordan took a great deal of care in making sure that badass scenes of violence were negated, at least to an extent. We see them from a limited perspective, often one that focuses on how random death is. I always got the strong impression that this was inspired by his time as a soldier. It reminds me of several interviews from the Ken Burns Vietnam War documentary, where soldiers try to express that one of the greatest shocks for them in combat was how completely random death was. The bravest, strongest, most disciplined soldiers don't live to be heroes, while only the weakest, most cowardly, and dumbest soldiers die. Who lives and who dies is usually just a matter of who happened to be standing where. Shigeru Mizuki's Showa series emphasizes this as well, showing that the author survived World War II more because of his incompetence than anything else, surviving battles only because he got lost or was too sick to participate. But in A Memory of Light, characters we like get heroic deaths or else survive despite all odds. Even Bella gets a heroic death. Look, I like Bella, but couldn't Trolloc literally just stop a little boy on a shaggy mare with its bare hands? If we were going to get a nod to Bella, why not have her survive to carry Randolph at the end of this series, showing that after everything she's been through, Bella isn't afraid of Trollocs was cool, but like, why is she a good sprinter now? Why was she even there? So with the extremely cinematic Hollywood rules portrayals of our characters, why give only Fail the gritty, realistic scenes of looking like a fool? Oh, and while we're talking about battles, what was up with Sanderson just straight up stealing the Battle of Austerlitz for the last battle? I went over this in detail in the summary video, but if you skipped it, Sanderson literally just took the Battle of Austerlitz, rotated and flipped the map, and reproduced it for the last battle. Robert Jordan often pulled from real battles for inspiration, but to my knowledge, he never just took an entire battle to save himself the work of writing one of his own. It's not like the battles even have any thematic connection. There's no meaning in the connection between them. It was just a way to make the battle feel real without having to do more research. Which is particularly ridiculous because the armaments involved are completely different. Channelers are so powerful that I think there's a real chance that the Shanshan Empire, if transported into modern times, could threaten a modern military. They can teleport. Demodred could kill hundreds with a single motion. What good is the high ground when the enemy can just destroy the ground itself? Matt's plan to have the Shan pretend to retreat didn't make any sense at all. They could have been a huge help in the battle. I get that Sanderson wanted to push the metaphor of playing cards and gambling, but a metaphor like that is only clever when it actually makes sense. What was the advantage of fighting for hours with the Shan away? The surprise of the return didn't actually accomplish anything. Sure, the Shan were a help when they returned, but the element of surprise didn't do anything to help at all. Also note that Matt knew the whole time that Fortuona might just not return. Why take the risk? It wasn't out of trust. We see from Matt's own thoughts that for reasons that are never explained, he just really wanted to hold something back, like in cards. Even in a card game, you don't lose the game just to hold one card back. He didn't even really need to bait out the Shadow's attack. They wanted it as bad as he did. We might be able to say that Matt didn't know that he was sincerely concerned that the Trollocs and Sharns would break away to pillage the South, but once they started actually marching, it would have been too late for a clean disengagement. Again, Matt has Rockin and Channelers. Trollocs might be able to escape him from a great distance, scattering in all directions, but once the ranks were formed and sent at him, there wasn't any more reason to intentionally lose a bit just to look weak, which is what we're explicitly told that he does. Look, if you liked the last battle, then great. It was certainly a long chapter, and some of the individual scenes were cool, but it seems incredible to me that it was stolen directly from a real battle and still managed to make no sense. Just the part about Hinterstop. I mean, it was funny, I guess, but did it make any sense at all? How did they manage to reclaim the river after respawning? The Shadow had Dreadlords and Trollocs there. What good did the children of the town do other than to just give the Trollocs a little snack to keep them on their feet longer? Like, literally, they were just feeding the Trollocs barely armed peasants, and there were Dreadlords nearby. Okay, so I told myself when I first started making these videos that I wasn't going to just be another snarky, smug critic. It's easy to poke holes. It's much harder to see the value in something flawed. But no. Olivia. How much was her role built up? Remember, back in Knife of Dreams, when Kedsuan notes that Olivia is watching and learning from the Aes Sedai's weaves. So you watch, and remember what I see. I must learn somehow if I am to help the Lord Dragon. I have learned more than you are aware of. It's good to see her putting all that knowledge to use by leaving Rand some money to help him die. This thing's almost as bad as Fane. Like, not quite as bad because she didn't show up until much later in the series, but that was built up so much, it felt like a joke. Like a bad joke. This is why I really wanted to talk about the themes before getting into my personal thoughts. So, still, all right, so I want to try to explain plainly what I think went on here. Again, I haven't looked into other fan opinions yet, so maybe everyone else just loved the books and I'm the only one out, but to me, it seems like it needs some apologetics. So I think that some of my shock at the ending is just that I wanted a different story from the one Robert Jordan was telling. This doesn't explain the little bits I just called out a second ago. Those were just objectively really dumb, but I'm also kind of disappointed in Chattin just being, the devil and like Fane not having anything more really going for him. And I think that actually is just that I was looking for something different from what Robert Jordan was trying to say. So I was raised Catholic. I like Christian symbolism. Outside of funerals, I haven't been to a church in over a decade, but I don't bear Christianity any ill will. I like Christian stories, especially when there's a unique spin. Trigun, for example, is one of my favorite manga and anime series. But I also grew up in America, and I'm far better at reading English than any other language. Like, I'm okay with Japanese, and for any other language, I'm basically just translating it, like using a dictionary and a grammar guide. I've done it, but it's real slow. I can't just read a Norse myth without having a bunch of books around me. So most stories that I've read have been inspired by Christian values. Part of what I liked about The Wheel of Time was the Eastern influence. The series is a blend of tropes that are familiar to me and tropes that are not. So I was really hoping for something new in the ending, something cosmic or unexpected. Not just weird fiction, though I do love that genre, but something really new and different. I was honestly a little worried when I started noticing all the black tentacles grabbing at Lanfear in the Dream Shard and grabbing at helpless people in Mordens and emerging from the ground during the last battle. If Chattin had just been Cthulhu, I would have been, if anything, more annoyed at it. Frankly, I'm still a little annoyed at all the random dark tentacles. It's overused and it had nothing to do with Chattin. It just felt like the cheapest way to say there's something alien about Chattin. I'm gonna try to quit complaining, but thinking things over, I had to remind myself that this isn't my series. It's Robert Jordan's. Sanderson helped at the end, but the Wheel of Time belongs to Jordan. It's his vision. And I don't think he brought in Eastern mythology and religion because he wanted to present a non-Christian worldview. Rather, I think he wanted to bolster the verisimilitude, the sense of realness of his story by making the world bigger than what we often see in traditional fantasy stories. So we have references to Jainism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and many other belief systems, just as we have different styles of clothing and different political structures. It makes the world feel more believable, more solid. But at the end of the day, it's still a story in a world built from Robert Jordan's worldview. We're all free to love it or hate it, but to appraise it, we need to judge it on its own terms. From that perspective, I think that the ending was, for the most part, really, really good. I mean, Thane and Olivia were still a major letdown in the last battle, but the confrontation between Rand and Chattin was just perfect for the story Robert Jordan wanted to tell. Which brings me to the other point that we need to keep in mind. Sanderson had to finish the series. Now, I don't really know for sure how Sanderson worked on the last books. I also haven't read any of Sanderson's other work. I actually really plan to. For everything I said negative about this, Sanderson's other work is on my list because, all considering, I think he did a great job. Based on my understanding of the series, I do not think that Sanderson changed anything major about the worldview or the end of the series. I actually get the impression that he took immense care in respecting Jordan's notes and the existing world, which, if you think about it, sounds incredibly difficult. Bear in mind that when Robert Jordan sat down to write a new Wheel of Time book, he didn't consider his own notes on future directions to be sacred. I mean, time was obviously Demandred in disguise when we first met him. He just was. Lord of Chaos both begins and ends with Demandred talking to Chattin, and it's clear that he did something great for Chattin during the book, but he doesn't actually do anything during the book. Time does. It's not until A Memory of Light that we learn that apparently he just sort of recruited time in some vague sense that never mattered. That's not how books work. But Jordan clearly decided that just making Time and Demandred be the same person wasn't actually what he wanted to do. Maybe he saw that fans picked up on it a bit too easily and wanted something a bit more subtle. Or consider The Eye of the World and all the references to Chattin as Sightblinder. Livingston's Origins of the Wheel of Time explains that originally Jordan was going to have each seal protected by another Eye of the World, and Chattin's servants would go and put out these eyes. But that would have been a lot less interesting than what we got, wouldn't it? So Jordan changed his mind. Imagine being Brandon Sanderson, hired to finish the series and given notes. You could probably ignore a couple of them, if only because there were probably direct inconsistencies. But you can't ignore too many without feeling like you're disrespecting Robert Jordan. I think this explains a lot of the stranger things from the last few books. Stuff that makes sense in the larger context of the series, but doesn't really flow well with the story. Swan and Brynn dying due to Min's vision makes sense, broadly speaking, but it felt like Sanderson just didn't really know how to work it in. Same for Moiraine and Tom's marriage. As I argued before, I think the relationship makes perfect sense, but the scene where it happened felt like it came kind of out of nowhere. Moiraine doesn't even really act like herself in that scene. Honestly, Sanderson never really seemed to really nail Moraine's voice. She really seems like a completely different character every time she shows up in the last couple of books. I've also mentioned before that Sanderson, at least in these books, just didn't seem to have the same mastery with prose that Jordan had. Sanderson struggled to narrate in character, and he flanderizes some of the characters. Just like the scene where Matt makes backstories for everyone. I can't get over it. It was so bad. I don't think I even need to explain why, do I? It was one of the worst scenes in the entire series, I think. It was completely different, tonally, from everything else. It was out of character for Matt and for the world as a whole. Same thing for Tamane's sense of humor. Since fairly early on, there was a little bit of humor in Tamane's being kind of deadpan and sarcastic, but it always felt very common and relatable to me. I can remember being a young man and being kind of obnoxious, then encountering older men who seemed at first to be completely boring and humorless until I learned that they were simply working on a different level of wit than I was, poking fun at me so subtly that in my youth and inexperience, I didn't even realize they were making fun of me. In Sanderson's writing, Tamane's sense of humor is practically his only defining trait. It comes up constantly and explicitly, completely ruining the point. But again, remember that Sanderson was finishing the series for someone else. His more cartoonish and overt, rather than subtle, depiction of characters probably wouldn't have felt strange if it had been consistent. It only stood out because it was a change, and it changed just as we entered the more serious and important part of the series. I don't even know if this is his usual style. It might have just been the best way he could have managed to handle Jordan's universe and characters. Perhaps he felt that he had to make sure that the characters still felt like themselves and decided that it was better to go too far than to fall short, making it feel kind of fanfiction-y. Moreover, though I didn't particularly like Sanderson's take on characterization, and I thought that his prose lacked a lot of Jordan's subtlety, the description of Chattin's breaking the world was fantastic. Much of the descriptive language used for scenes near Shia Ghul was absolutely incredible. Despite my complaints about Matt and Tomanes, reading the last 3 Wheel of Time books actually has me, again, really, really wanting to read some of Sanderson's other work. Like, even the scene with the character sheets, it was bad because it was out of character. It was funny on its own. If it had been consistent, I would have probably enjoyed that scene. It was just very odd in the Wheel of Time. So that's probably not what I'm going to do next. I'm going to get to what I'm doing next in just a little bit here, but Sanderson's definitely on my list. Anyways, my point here is that I think we got the ending that Robert Jordan wanted. I don't think that Sanderson changed anything significant or worked his own worldview in any intentional way. I also think the ending was overall pretty good with just a few glaring exceptions for the worldview and message that Robert Jordan wanted to present to us. The very end in particular really stood out for me. There's a part of me that really wanted Rand to announce himself rather than sneaking away. There's so much good he could do for the world. Even if he steps down as a direct leader of people, the things he remembers from the Age of Legends and the things he learned outside of the pattern could be invaluable. At the very least, go tell Tam that he doesn't need to grieve. But that's me. That's what I imagine doing. But it's not what Rand would do. The Wheel of Time was, in some ways, an unusual fantasy adventure. It's far more complicated than a simple swashbuckling adventure. Yet for all its characters, high concept themes, and world building, it's still an adventure, a journey. Each book begins with a wind sweeping through the world on an endless journey with no beginning or ending. How else could Rand's story have ended except by the start of a new journey? As he notes, he hasn't even seen all that much of the world, mostly just the inside of palaces. When he lights his pipe without channeling, we see that there are still mysteries left in the world, perhaps even new mysteries born in the new age. The Wheel of Time isn't a literary work to end all works, but another step in a series. Just as other works, such as The Lord of the Rings and the stories of King Arthur, inspired the Wheel of Time, so too does it hope to inspire new works. To go back to our main themes, the series ends with Rand having overcome a great hardship. For all of his suffering, for everything that's changed, he has learned to put it all behind him and look forward to the next adventure. He came like the wind touched everything, and like the wind was gone. All right, so that covers most of what I want to say about the Wheel of Time. I have a couple little bits at the very end of the video, but before I kind of get into that, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes just sort of talking about this project and the channel, like what I'm planning to do next after the Wheel of Time. And before I lose anyone, yes, as I mentioned before, I am going to continue making videos. I'd actually like to just be completely transparent here for just a couple of minutes and explain my thought process on choosing a new project. So, it's been more than a year since I quit my job to focus on more creative and meaningful projects. Right after I quit, I just tried a little of everything. Sketching, painting, playing guitar and piano, writing fiction, writing reviews, and probably some other stuff I don't even remember. After a couple of months of this, I started to see that my time working in tech may be a little bit rusty at dealing with anything artistic, and I decided that before I could try creating anything, I really had to spend some time reading, listening, watching, and playing to expose myself to more sources of inspiration. But I didn't want to just lounge about passively experiencing things, so I started a blog to force myself to really think each thing I experienced through to grow my perspective. After writing several lawn essays, I found that it's really hard to get any feedback on lawn written essays, so I started making videos. It's been about 9 months now, and I'm finding that I really, really enjoy making these videos, and I'd like to spend more time doing this. Long term, I have a couple of directions I'd like this to go in. First, I really like the sense of community I feel from reading and responding to all of your comments. I don't think I can stress this enough. I don't have a huge following, but a few of you have posted so many comments that I've come to really look forward to seeing what you have to say about each new video. Seriously, if Exia, I don't know how you say it, or Anonymously Opinionated don't have something to say within a few days of a new video, I start to worry. And just in the last couple of months, I've picked up a couple of new followers that are watching and commenting as they do their own rereads of the series. I have a really hard time not clicking the little heart on every single reply. Most of the comments I get are really well thought out, often presenting an idea I didn't think of or a correction to something I misunderstood. I've yet to receive a single mean comment, and everyone has been really careful not to post any spoilers. If I haven't responded to one of your comments, it's only because I couldn't think of anything clever to say. I've read every comment at least once, and I always try to come up with a response. Just sometimes I just can't think of anything clever, so I just give it a thumbs up or a heart. Again, I quit my very cushy, lucrative job to do this. Friends and family occasionally ask me if I ever feel like this was a mistake or if I consider going back. Of course I do. It's been more than a year, and I still have daily moments where I'll briefly just panic, asking myself, what the hell am I doing? I can't believe I did this. I need to see if I can get my job back. It's been way too late now. I have to start prepping for interviews. God, it's been so many years since I did an interview. That's going to be rough. Like, technical code interviews is a skill, and I am definitely rusty at it. Oh my God. But whenever I feel that way, I just check my phone and I look to see if I have any comments or new subscribers. And just seeing that completely dispels any sense that I made a mistake. Like, it doesn't just help, it eliminates any feeling of it. Your feedback and your support make this worthwhile. Honestly, I don't really watch many other booktubers myself. I've tried, but most channels I found just don't really talk with the sort of intensity that I'm trying to provide here and that I'm receiving in turn from your comments. That probably comes off as arrogant, but I don't mean this as a value judgment. Reaction videos, lore analysis, and reviews are all really good content. But as you've come to see, I really like to get into the broad themes, tying fiction back to matters of philosophy and psychology, building a network of meaning between works of fiction, but centered on reality. Part of me wants to go into academia to get more of this, but I just can't stand the bureaucracy and egotism that would require. I'm pretty sure that most people would say that my videos are too serious or even dry, certainly too long, and that's fine with me. That's the great thing about the internet. I can find the handful of people who want a long section on the civil rights movement and the role of ambiguity in fiction when talking about an epic fantasy series. I'll talk about swords and make some silly faces and snarky comments from time to time, but it's not the point. I don't even know what the point is, to be perfectly honest. I sometimes feel like I'm digging around the edges of some really important ideas, too big to be approached directly, so we can only glimpse them indirectly through metaphor and fiction. If I have to, I'll keep digging alone, but it's a hell of a lot easier with friends. So long term, I'd love to grow this community. Maybe some of you are interested in making your own videos. I'm still an amateur myself, but that kind of puts me in the perfect place to give tips to other people who are just getting started, so you can skip some of the mistakes I've made over the past year. Maybe I could even use this channel to publish other people's content, or we could have some kind of like an interview or a discussion circle or something like that. I haven't really thought it all through yet, but there's a lot of options there. And although YouTube comments are great, I would love to have something like a Discord server. Like, I already have several Discord servers I run for various like hobbies and other social groups, but I feel like it'd be a little premature to have one for this channel right now. I feel like it would be too focused on Wheel of Time in particular. So when I move on to other things, it would feel like it's still essentially a Wheel of Time server. And B, I think I don't really have enough followers yet. I feel like it's a little premature at this point. I think this is more of a long-term goal, but I'm also not sure. I'm still trying to figure this out. Maybe I'm overthinking it. But this brings me to the problem that I'm facing short term. No matter what I pick next, it probably won't be appealing to everyone watching me right now. And even if I could find something that fit, that would only delay the issue, as I'll eventually want to branch out to something new and different. I've frankly been feeling a little bit stuck lately as I get close to the end of the series. I really don't want to lose anyone currently watching, especially not any of you that leave comments. It probably sounds a little silly, but it would feel a little bit like losing a friend if I lost one of my frequent commenters. But I started this whole project by taking a huge leap, and I can't check it out now. What I can do is be intentional in how I branch out from where we are now to try to keep people happy as much as possible. Which brings me to the second direction I want to take things. I still want to focus on looking at literature as a source of inspiration for creating my own work. Really our own work. Nothing would make me happier than hearing that someone who watched my videos went on to write their own book or what have you, inspired in part by something I said. So with that in mind, I think I know generally where to go from here. To simultaneously grow this community and keep from losing anyone, I plan on mixing things up more. Rather than spending most of a year on just one series, I plan on jumping around a little bit more. So even if you're not interested in one video, you'll hopefully be interested in the next one. To focus on critiquing literature as a source of inspiration for new work, I want to choose things that I feel would have value as a source of inspiration or understanding. Though I don't have anything like a schedule at this point, I have a few ideas for the near future. The Wheel of Time was heavily inspired by mythology and folklore. I'm planning on doing some videos that dig into old myths that we're all vaguely aware of, but applying a great deal more scrutiny. Plenty of other channels already explain old myths and do so very well, but I think we can go deeper, analyzing not just the lore of the myths, but also digging into themes and characters similar to what we've done with the Wheel of Time. I won't just ask who Galahad is, but why he's that way, or what that meant for people at the time, and what that time spanned, and what it means for us now. Of course, I don't want to just stick to King Arthur and Norse mythology. There's a whole world of stories out there, each with their own perspectives to offer. Like, I absolutely love old Japanese ghost stories. That'd be another great one to go into. There are also completely different genres. I mentioned before how much I'd love to talk about some of William Gibson's work. I'd also like to discuss some horror and weird fiction. One of the first essays I wrote when I started my blog was about M.R. James and Lovecraft. There's a lot to talk about there. But I also really like fantasy. And after finishing The Wheel of Time, as I've said, I really do want to give Sanderson a bit of a try. And I do plan on getting into Cosmere at some point. I haven't yet decided whether I'll do a video per book or if I'll lump a few together. Like, I might just do one video for the first Mistborn era as an example. But I think I'll really need to read some of the books before I can get a feel for whether it makes sense to dig into them book by book, looking into summaries at the beginning and then discussion afterwards like I have for The Wheel of Time, or if I want to have a somewhat different format for books in different series. Like I landed on one format that I think was good for The Wheel of Time, but I don't know if that's the format that I'll need to use for everything. I might need to change it up based on what I'm actually reading or playing or watching. Of course, we also don't need to stay too close to The Wheel of Time. Like the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant or Dying Earth are other series that I've really been meaning to read for a long time. That would be great. Maybe some more of Ursula Le Guin stuff would be great as well. And also, as I mentioned before, I'd really like to cover some video games. In particular, I'd really like to cover some games that I think are missing the kind of analysis and discussion I can offer. My first thought is to cover something like Final Fantasy V with an emphasis on themes, references, and cultural impact, looking at the game as a work of literature rather than just a video game that is now very outdated. So again, I don't have a schedule ready, but I plan on rotating between these different types of video and kind of calibrating what types of video I put out and how I format them as I go. This way we can grow our community to bring in people who might not care about the Wheel of Time in particular, but are interested in the sorts of discussion we've been having. But I can also at least try to ensure that nobody watching right now is going to be left without something they're interested in for too long. So short term, it'll probably be a couple of months, maybe like even 3 months. I don't know exactly, until I get a new video out, as I'm going to need some time to branch out, try some different things and see what works. There are a few series that I've been really wanting to read, but I'm actually not sure if they make good videos. So I want to try reading them, and then if a video comes out of it, cool. But if I don't feel like I could deliver a good video, I'd rather deliver no content than bad content. There's a lot of content out there. Like, I don't want to lose anyone that is currently watching. I don't want anyone to say, hey, there's been no new video for 4 months, so I'm going to, stop checking in on Luke. But I would hate it even more to give you a crappy video just because I was just putting something out for the month. So if you want to help me out through this process, I'd really, really appreciate it if you use comments to provide feedback, both when I do something you like, but even more importantly, when I do something you don't care for. If I put out a few videos in a row that you don't like, let me know in a comment and let me know what you do want me to cover, or at least something vaguely that you want to cover, and I'll do what I can to keep everyone happy. I'm not going to cover anything I'm not personally interested in, both for my own sake, but also because I think that would result in a passionless video. But I'm interested in a lot of things. Like, I'm sure we can find more overlap. So, all right, with all that out of the way, let's close out the series with some less formal comments, just kind of chatting about it. So first off, I have to say, I get the impression that people think I don't like Egwene. Here at the end of the series, I want to make it clear, I like Egwene a lot. My League Start Sorceress in Diablo 2 Resurrected both this season and last season was named Egwene. In terms of personality, she's probably the Wheel of Time character most like me when I was her age. When I say something like, Egwene would have been a terrible peacetime Amyrlin, I would also absolutely say that about myself when I was her age. Of course, I have kind of a hard time not identifying with Rand the most. I mean, he's the main perspective character. We spend the most time in his head. But I also grew up in a place where there weren't really a lot of people with red hair, so I'm always going to identify with a tall redhead. Though I will admit, as a treat for anyone who stuck around for all of this, that learning from the Wheel of Time companion that Rand is a couple inches taller than me did make me completely lose any sense of empathy for him at all whatsoever. Seriously, how many men in the Wheel of Time are exactly 6'6"? It's at least 3, and Bale is 6'10". At least I'm taller than Logain. Like, yes, I checked, I'm that petty, but good God, is this genetic engineering from the Age of Legends? Practically every significant male character, not given a specific height, is just tall. Even Matt, the runt of the Emmons Field Boys, is 5'11", and Perrin's taller than Matt. Are Bashir, Talmanes, and Iderald the only short men in the Wheel of Time? Anyways, it really is hard not to love just all the characters in the Wheel of Time. I think I mentioned before that I really, really like Varen. I like to think that she'd like my videos, but they're probably too shallow for her. I'd probably need a few decades of brown before I'd be able to make something properly comprehensive. And yes, I would almost certainly go for brown. I respect the yellows a lot, and I definitely consider it, but come on, centuries to read and write and magical abilities to aid in research, traveling to libraries around the world without needing to fly. I really do hope, however, the Black Tower establishes its own Ajas, if only because I want Flynn to be the first Weaver for the men. I also really want to emphasize, again, how much I like Nynaeve's character growth. Pretty much every main character in the Wheel of Time is great, but Nynaeve is unique in how slow her growth was and in how quietly she became one of the wisest characters in the series. Perrin's growth was similarly slow and steady, but Nynaeve didn't really get the same sort of crystallizing moments that Perrin got when he forged Ma'alenar or when he accepted his dual nature in the dream. The closest Nynaeve gets is her test, but even there, the real point of that scene to me is what she says to Egwene afterwards. To see her grow from being an arrogant, insecure chauvinist into the sort of person capable of real critical introspection without ever losing her passion to heal the world no matter what anyone says. I mean, Rand calls us out too. The Aes Sedai didn't ruin her. I don't think she's going to let them. All right, I don't want this to just be a long sequence of characters that I liked, as we'd be here all day, and it would mostly be stuff I've already said, but I do need to call out that Min is best girl. I mean, she's got a real strength to her, a sort of ambition without ego. She's capable of amazing bravery and dedication, but never really for herself. She understands things on a level that no one else comes close to. If she could have taken Rand's place, I think she would have accomplished everything he did with ease. But she also knows that it's not her story. I think she's actually got a fair bit of trickster spirit in her, maybe even more than Matt in a way. For all the wannabe wise mentors in the Wheel of Time, Tam and Min are the only two who really managed to pull it off successfully. On a completely different topic, part of me has wanted a whole spin-off for Matt and Perrin since really early in the series. Their powers are just so different from everything else we see in the Wheel of Time. It's incredible to me that Robert Jordan was able to build so many different wonders into the same world coherently, without it feeling like a season of American Horror Story, which, as much as I love that show, sometimes it gets wacky enough that it's kind of hard to take seriously. I think they do that by design. The way Perrin and Matt's thoughts worked reminded me so much of my own thoughts, but just in very different moments. When I'm feeling introspective, I'm Perrin. When I'm feeling bored, I'm Matt. I really am going to really miss all these characters. Did I ever get a real chance to talk about how Thor was split across Rand and Perrin? I don't want to go too deep into that right now, but basically I think that Rand takes some of the more religious or fantastic aspects of Thor, while Perrin is more in common with what we see Thor do in myth. If you want to see lightning bolts thrown down to destroy the enemy, then you get Rand. If you want to see someone pick up a big hammer and head out to slay a bunch of giants, you get Perrin. The comparison with Matt as Odin is also interesting. Though both Thor and Odin, or if I'm trying to pronounce things correctly, that'd be what? Thor and Othin? I'm going to stick with Thor and Odin. Just that's what I'm capable of. But though both Thor and Odin have a lot of history to them, one interpretation of the two characters has them representing different classes, with Odin representing nobility and Thor representing more common people. I mean, they're both gods, and worship of Thor didn't, to my knowledge, really reflect this split much. But from myth, we can see that Odin generally winds up looking cool and smart, whereas Thor often makes himself the butt of a joke. The clearest example of this probably comes from the Lay of Harbard, where Odin, in disguise as a ferryman, denies Thor passage and the two have an argument. Odin ridicules Thor's peasant diet and clothing while bragging about his sexual conquest, magical powers, and tactical skill in battle. Thor mostly just brags about killing giants. In the end, Odin tells Thor to walk around the river, and Thor is stuck looking like a fool. As a scene, this really brings to mind Matt and Rand's bragging contest, but as a theme, I can't help but notice that Rand and Matt both take to fancy coats and palaces after a while, but Perrin maintains his dislike of riches throughout the entire series. He'd much rather have a hunk of meat and the time to hit something with his hammer than drink wine in the palace. I'm really curious how he's going to fare now that Fail's going to be Queen of Saldea. All right, what else is there? Did anyone else notice that Loyal married Eris from Final Fantasy VII? I mean, they're both just named Earth, But still, I couldn't help but say Aerith as Eris in my head every time I saw her name, because Eris is the better English pronunciation. I don't care if it's supposed to be Earth. It's Erisu in Japanese. It's Eris. Oh, I never got to talk about Egwene making Leolwyn her warder. So this is a fairly minor point that didn't really fit into any of my analysis sections, but I think it's worth considering why Egwene made Leolwyn her warder. In that moment, Egwene was wounded from Gawain's death, but she wanted to be a strong Amyrlin. To be a strong Amyrlin, Egwene refuses to let herself wallow in misery when she should be out fighting. But she doesn't take Leolwyn as her warder as a show of strength, and I don't think it was really even about practical necessity either. Just before Egwene announces that she'll need a new warder, she thinks to herself, quote, Gawain had not been a weakness to her. From this, I think we can say that Egwene taking Leolwyn as warder is actually an expression of grief. She wants to prove that Gawain wasn't a weakness, so she must show that, without him, she is less than she was with him. What better way to do that than to take a new warder? I also wanted to very briefly touch on some of the parallels that pop up between everyone who goes out to fight Demandred during the last battle. So, I've already talked about Gawain a fair bit, and how I think he's actually an important perspective for us in the Wheel of Time. Gawain can see greatness. He's surrounded by great people, and he's often in positions where a great deed could prove to him to be their equal, but he's just never quite good enough. He's good looking, but not an object of worship like Galad. He's good with a sword, but Mat beats him with a quarterstaff, and Lan's the one who kills Demandred. He's in a position to support his sister as queen, but then he watches as some stupid peasant comes in, steals her heart, and goes on to be far more important than her, leaving Gawain behind in near obscurity, at least in comparison. He comes to focus his frustration at always being just barely not good enough solely on Rand, the man who just walks in and wins everything without even wanting it. Which actually makes him a lot like Loghain. The pattern demanded a dragon, and so I came. Too soon, just a little too soon. Much earlier, in Knife of Dreams, when Lews Therin seizes sight in from Rand and prepares to kill himself with it, Loghain notes, why are you still holding the power? And so much. If you're trying to show me that you're stronger than I am, I already know it. I saw how large your death gates were compared to mine. Loghain's even a few inches shorter than Rand, though still tall. Like Gawain, he's actually pretty amazing. I mean, the average person in the Wheel of Time is a farmer or a spinner. Even the Ashaman falls short compared to Loghain, just as the best warders couldn't stand against Gawain with a sword. Yet neither was quite as good as they thought they had to be. They both come to accept this in the end, at least for the most part. I suppose it's debatable whether Gawain truly accepted this, given that he died in a mad effort to kill Demandred, but really, I don't think that was a bad plan. With just a little more luck, he could have saved tens of thousands of lives. Don't let survival dictate the moral of the story for you. Gawain died, but he died in an effort to do the right thing, and he died with a mind clear of envy and hate. Time, on the other hand, certainly doesn't grow past his jealousy. He's in a very similar situation, but he never accepts that he's just not as powerful or as important as Rand. Instead, Time goes looking for power among the Forsaken, and he even becomes one of them, only to find that Demandred still outclasses him. Ironically, Demandred himself falls to the same trap, never accepting that he's not the dragon. As Elaine sees, Demandred, with his full circle in Sangreal, does surpass Rand's strength, but Rand doesn't even join the battle. Demandred comes off looking like a fool, spending nearly all of his time in the entire series just begging Rand to come out and fight him. Powerful, yes, but to what end? Loghain nearly succumbs as well, desiring the power to ensure that no one can ever make him feel powerless ever again. But Loghain succeeds in growing past this by looking to other people. I really like how we see Demandred almost do the same with the Sharans. He recognizes there's a place for him, a really good place, as a hero. He could have done so much good if he just wasn't obsessed with having the most power. Loghain accepts his still very lofty position as leader of the Black Tower. Gawain came to accept his position as the Amyrlin's warder, at least for the most part. Demandred finds that even having the most power brings him no peace, as he can't prove it without Rand's willing cooperation in a senseless duel, and Time finds that he can't even be the best villain. Alright, so part of me wants to just keep going, but if I really want to branch out into new things, then I've got to start sometime. So let's call it here. I should have a new video out sometime in the next few months. I really hope you enjoyed my coverage of the Wheel of Time. Until next time.